When it comes to filmmaking, found footage is something we don't see much of anymore. These types of movies were popular in the late 90s and early 2000s, but they fizzled out in the 2010s and onwards. I've always been a fan of the genre when it's handled well, so today I'll be covering 3 of what I consider to be the best found footage movies out there. I mainly like found footage because it has a sense of realism that other films can't capture. While the scenarios might not feel realistic, the emotions of those in front of and behind the camera do. Even the name found footage implies that what we're watching was once lost, giving the movie an air of mystery before it even starts. I want to go over how each of the 3 films I'm discussing have utilized the found footage format and how it's evolved over time. I'm aware that the first movie to use found footage was Cannibal Holocaust, though I won't be covering that movie here since there's already countless videos made about it. In case you haven't seen them yet, there's going to be spoilers for the movies in this video. But without further ado, let's get started. If we're talking about found footage, it's impossible not to bring up the Blair Witch Project. Released in 1999, this would be a lot of people's first exposure to the genre, and it left an impact. Some audiences genuinely thought that what they were watching was real, because they had never seen anything like this before. The movie opens with the message that 3 student filmmakers vanished into the woods of Maryland in 1994, and what we're watching is their last known footage. Like the rest of the movies in this video, it starts off pretty innocently. We get introduced to Heather, Josh, and Michael as they interview locals in their hometown for a documentary they're making about the Blair Witch. Throughout the movie, it occasionally switches between Heather and Michael's cameras, with Heather's being a black and white 16mm. With this being the second movie ever to use this type of filming, it's fairly straightforward in its cinematography, but that doesn't mean the film isn't effective. The 3 students start to venture into the woods, with Heather capturing their journey as they search for any traces of the Blair Witch. If you're already familiar with this movie, you know that the Blair Witch is never shown on screen. The Blair Witch Project works off the fear of the unknown, as the students are constantly on edge about what's in the woods and how completely lost they are. The film also isn't afraid to have sequences in total darkness and only use the sounds of whatever is stalking them every night. Heather continues to record even after realizing their days are numbered. Being arguably the most tame out of the 3 movies in this video, the found footage perspective in this film allows the viewer to understand how horrifying of a scenario this would be to live through. Their situation goes from bad to worse when Josh disappears one night, and we get to see how badly this affects Heather and Michael. The final act of the movie is the most unnerving, when Heather and Michael find a decrepit house in the dead of night. At this point, they seem to have both lost their mind as they hear distant screams all over the house while looking for anything that might help them. It switches between Heather and Michael's cameras as they search through the house. The film ends with Michael running downstairs thinking he hears Josh, but his camera gets knocked over once he enters the basement. Heather screams his name as she follows him downstairs, and we get the iconic standing in the corner scene. The last thing we see is Heather's camera falling over as the film inside of it finally wears out. The Blair Witch Project uses the fear of the unknown and lets our minds fill in the blanks, but the next movie is quite the opposite in that regard. Cloverfield is what you get when you combine found footage and kaijus. While the Blair Witch is quiet and takes time in building up its horror, Cloverfield is fast-paced and chaotic. With monster movies now focusing more on scale and cool fight scenes, Cloverfield takes a grounded approach to the genre. This film managed to capture the sheer panic that would ensue if something like this took place. I don't think the feeling of realism would be there if this movie was filmed normally. Cloverfield opens with the message that the footage we're seeing is government property. We're given less insight on what to expect, which makes the events later on much more impactful to see unfold. The movie begins with Rob and Beth filming their day around New York City. At the end of the day, a farewell party is held for Rob in celebration for his new job overseas. Rob's brother Jason gets his best friend Hud to film the party so he can have some memories to look back on after he leaves. This doesn't last long, however. With it being a found footage film, the monster only shows up a handful of times. This builds up the monster to make it more threatening every time it does show up. Soon after, it attacks the bridge while everyone is evacuating, and it ends up taking Jason's life in the process. HUD records an aerial view of the monster that's being shown on the news, but they manage to get a view of it up close. The group takes refuge in a subway, and Rob calls his mom to let her know what happened to Jason. After some much-needed rest, they start to make their way through the subway tunnels. This is when we get what's arguably the scariest scene in the movie. HUD turns on night vision to find out they're being stalked by the parasites that came off the creature. Marlena is bitten during the attack, and her condition is getting worse by the minute. They come across a military outpost in one of the station exits, but right as they arrive, Marlena's bite causes her to implode. Rob is still dead set on saving Beth, so the commanding officer tells the group they have until 5 in the morning to get her and evacuate. HUD, Jason, and Lily make their way into Beth's apartment and find her impaled, and HUD actually puts the camera down to help the others pull her out. In the last few minutes, you can feel the urgency and panic coming from the characters through the camera. The group manages to get on a helicopter only moments away from the monster being stealth bombed. Despite surviving the crash, the monster shows up again for a closer look before HUD falls victim to it. Rob and Beth grab the camera and take shelter beneath a bridge to record their final messages. A nuke drops and ends the footage, but not before cutting back to an old recording one last time. One of the reasons why I like Cloverfield is that it took found footage in a new direction. While some might argue the found footage aspect ruined the movie, I don't agree with them. Because the focus of this film isn't the monster. The focus is showing the reality of experiencing something like this firsthand. After Cloverfield, we get what I consider to be the best found footage movie to this day, Chronicle. What all three of these movies have in common is that the characters are recording as a form of documentation. With Chronicle, our main character Andrew uses his camera as a way to express himself, but also as a way to put a barrier between him and other people. We get to see how hard Andrew's life is at home and at school, but things change when he, along with his cousin Matt and another student named Steve, investigate a cave in the woods. Andrew's camera glitches out in the cave. Then the footage cuts to the boys now having telekinesis. They get stronger and more comfortable with their powers over the course of the movie. There's a clear difference in filming before and after Andrew gets telekinesis. It starts out as handheld, but once the boys have powers, the camera simply floats around them. While still being found footage, Andrew's telekinesis allows the framing to look more cinematic. Both the Blair Witch Project and Cloverfield show how erratic filming can be for people who are forced into life-threatening situations. But Chronicle shows how a found footage film can be unique with its presentation. Steve and Matt encourage Andrew to join their school's talent show, but an embarrassing moment at a party leaves him more depressed. Andrew films his change of behavior, like pulling a spider apart, yanking a bully's teeth out of his mouth, and throwing his abusive dad around like a rag doll. He waits in the sky hoping to get struck by lightning, but Steve shows up trying to talk him down. Steve ends up getting hit instead. Then the footage cuts to his funeral. Now broken at this point, Andrew uses his powers to rob people to get money for his dying mother. So he puts on his dad's old firefighter gear and continues to record himself. But it's not long until one of these robberies blows up in his face. With his camera destroyed, the film uses angles from other devices for the final act. Cameras inside a hospital show Andrew's dad coming to see him. Matt senses Andrew waking up, then he and his girlfriend Casey leave to investigate. Initially, the perspective is through Casey's camera, but it switches around when Andrew and Matt start fighting. We watch the fight through phones of bystanders, security cameras, dash cams, and helicopters. Found footage movies don't usually switch perspectives like this, so it was a breath of fresh air to see how Chronicle handled that. After a devastating fight throughout Seattle, Andrew is too unstable to be left alive. Matt uses the arm of a nearby statue to impale Andrew and end his rampage. The last thing we see is Matt in Tibet with his own camera, which is where Andrew wanted to travel to once they were done with high school. Matt gives Andrew a final message before flying off and leaving the camera behind. What I admire most about the film is that it was able to show what found footage is capable of. Chronicle was able to prove that with enough creativity, found footage can be applied to any genre. Well, you made it to the end of the video. As always, I hope you enjoyed watching. Like I said before, I still have a soft spot for found footage movies, but I only wish the genre was given more of a chance. I had fun dissecting the different filming styles for these movies, and if you like any of the content I've made so far, be sure to subscribe and stay notified for when I upload. I'll see you in the next one.